Hello, everyone. Welcome to FARSIGHT Friday. My name is Farah Bala. My pronouns are she, her. I am the founder of FARSIGHT. We are a leadership organizational development consultancy, and our mission is to redefine leadership in a way that prioritizes equity, diversity, inclusion, anti-oppression, anti-racism. And FARSIGHT Friday is our community podcast that started in 2020. We are now on our third season. Thank you to our esteemed guests for joining us. I'm going to hand it over to each of you to please introduce yourselves to us and why you do what you do.
This is Pheng, he, him, his. I'm based here in Wisconsin, in the Fox Valley area. I have been working in gender-based violence movement for close to 20 years, primarily in the Southeast Asian community and more specifically in the Hmong community, really around engaging men and masculine folks. And developing new ideas on and new concepts on what that looks like in our communities across the country and world, I should say. So that's just a brief nutshell of me. Thank you.
I'm Stephen Burrell. I'm based in the UK, in a city called Durham, in the northeast of England. And I work at Durham University. I'm a researcher primarily, and my research is all about how to engage men and boys in preventing gender-based violence, really. I suppose looking more broadly at issues around men and masculinity. And it's been a field I've been interested in for a very long time, because I suppose I kind of started learning about feminist ideas since I was a teenager at school, studying sociology, which I love and I can recommend it to anyone to get involved in. It just had a huge impact on me, and I became really committed to wanting to share feminist ideas, what I was learning from feminist women, feminist activists, with other men, I suppose, because I think it's got so much to offer us. Thank you. It's great to be here.
My name is Daniel Castillo, he, him, his, and I'm based in Los Angeles, and I've been doing community organizing for more than a decade. And in my community organizing work, I was able to work with young boys in middle school, high school, and also in college, but I was also able to work with young men in prison. And so that informed a lot of my pedagogy. It informed a lot of what I thought was needed to do men's work. And one of the things I think is important for me to be in this work is to be in community with other men, right? That's when we begin to explore, what are these concepts of manhood? What are these concepts of maleness come from, to really explore them and to examine them to see if they create any harm in our own relationships, but our relationships with ourselves, but also with our relationships with our partners and our communities. And so every single time I'm in a group, in a community with other men, I'm blessed and honored to be part of that discussion, so that we can offer each other gifts and to push and hold each other accountable to who we say we want to be.
My name is Greene, he, him. I have spent over a decade writing and speaking about so-called MANBOX culture, or dominance-based masculinity. I share Daniel's interest in what this larger culture, a dominant culture of masculinity, has taught generations of boys and men about what it means to be a man and the kinds of challenges that arise out of a hierarchical, dominance-based model of masculinity. So I will continue my work trying to better understand how boys and men both avoid falling prey to that trap of hierarchical dominance-based masculinity, but also how men, if they've been suffering under the yoke of that, what kind of work they do in groups of men to free themselves from it.
For anyone who is unfamiliar with some of the terminology that you are using, gender-based violence, dominance culture, MANBOX culture, I'd love to hear from each of you, what is that? What are those systemic messages around this culture? I want to hear from each of you with the nuance and lens of your own lived experience with the identities that you hold. What's very exciting to me about this grouping of all of you men is you are encompassing geographies, class, locations, race, ethnicity, migration. Each layer of that identity, of those identities, have certain masculinity messaging that overlaps with each other, but is also unique with each other. So I'd love to hear from your perspective, what is MANBOX culture? What is dominance-based masculinity? What is What are these messages of masculinity that have systemically and historically come down to boys and men?
For me, man box culture or dominance-based masculinity is simply a very narrow, stereotypical, caricaturish idea of what a man is. And the rules of man box culture were first conceptualized by a guy named Paul Kivel, who was doing work on gender violence in the Oakland area in the early 1980s. And Paul Kivel basically went around to high schools and asked boys, what are the rules for being a man? And what he found out was the rules were fairly narrow and fairly simple. They included things like don't show your emotions, always be tough, never show pain, be a breadwinner, never a caregiver. There were rules like be heterosexual, never homosexual, have power over women and girls. If you're going to have a conversation with other men, make it about sex or money or cars. Don't talk about anything deep. And the end result of these sort of ideas was that if a boy or a man began to show too much emotion, began to break any of the other rules of the man box, turned out that began to express that he was not in fact heterosexual, that the other boys and men in his cohort would begin to bully him back into that box or reject him entirely. And so it is not simply a set of rules for how to be a man, but the enforcement of those rules. And sometimes that enforcement can be up to and including violence and murder. So we have all grown up in a culture of masculinity, which taught us that we have to hide our authentic selves, we have to hide our emotional expression, and we have to conform to rules. And we also are obligated to police the men around us to do the same.
What we've come to know in the last few years as toxic masculinity actually stems from that understanding. It's just probably a rephrasing of the man box and those traditional norms and ideas. And then I think culturally, in different ethnic groups and cultural groups across the country, each community defines its own and has its own understanding of what it means to be a man. And so in the context of racism, right? In the context of racism, and I think that is so important for us to understand that, because as a Hmong man, my definition of what it means in my community is very different than the definition of what others may see me in general society as a Asian man, and as an Asian American man, as a Southeast Asian man, as somebody who probably knows only martial arts, or somebody who is a nerd. But I am none of that either, because my community's immigration, quote unquote, and status here in the US is very different than that of East Asian folks. And so I think that there's some nuances there that we have to peel when we try to understand, to Farah's your question on geographic location in our identities. It's really important to understand those nuances in the different communities in terms of how and what is being shaped by our understanding of men and masculinity. And I want to add the other part about it is that for me, it's so vitally important that we include men and masculinity, because masculinity, for those people who probably don't identify as men, who don't identify as living men experiences, who want to express masculinity, who are expressing masculinity through their gender or through their expression. And that is very important too, as well too, because they also benefit from the privileges of manhood and masculinity as they become more expressing and more attuned to what people may think of them as a man or a masculine identified person, right?
We still live in a very patriarchal society, right, in which men as a group, have more power. But obviously, it's also much more complex than that. I mean, that works differently in different contexts, and it also interconnects with other systems of power, such as racism and colonialism and capitalism, like class-based societies, which means actually in reality, it's, some men have a lot more power than other men as well. And these things all make up and shape our identities, but we also have some degree of agency to kind of resist these things and do things differently, but I do think that those wider social structures play a big role in shaping our kind of culture, the kinds of norms and expectations which we kind of are pressured to go along with, and a lot of those kinds of cultural norms and expectations help to perpetuate help to perpetuate those wider power relations, I guess, where men, so legitimizing the idea that men should be powerful, men should be strong, in control of the people around us, of ourselves. And that has a huge range of detrimental impacts on the people around us, but also on ourselves, I think. Actually, in the end, it doesn't benefit anyone, even if it does keep some people, in positions of power over others, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all that has been said. Certainly, there's complexities in the way that we define masculinity, and even in our own identities. It depends on the region. It depends where you're growing up. Oftentimes, our identity is often culture. I mean, it's often cultivated in the space that you grew up in, right? In your environment. So the places that you grew up in, even when you think back at some of your childhood memories, you can think about the land itself. You can think about whether you had trees or did you grow up in a city like I did where there's concrete. All those things form who you are form your identity. And so when I think about masculinity, I think about, well, what are all the things that inform who we are and the way that we identify with masculinity as men growing up in these cities? Oftentimes I think about, well, is it, I often contend this, like, I know that we talk about masculinity and here are all the different definitions of masculinity, but is it, I always go back to this, is like, is it really, are those the definitions that we come up with? Or are those the definitions that were forced down on us to practice, to enact? And I think about all the different systems that play a part in helping form those definitions and identities. And I think about the mass incarceration system and the way that it played a huge role in breaking up families and breaking up fathers and children, right? And so now you have young folks in the streets trying to figure out, well, what is a man when there are no men in the street? There are no men in the home. When I think about the child welfare system, the way that they've devastated the families. And also, not only that, when you take it further back, right? Again, this is a historical issue. This stuff is nothing new. When you look at the patterns from history upon history upon history, you see that the devastation of men has always been, especially Black and brown men, have always been has always been in play. When you go back to slavery, when you think about the West Africans, the enslaved West Africans who came from the West African continent, they were ripped apart from their families and they were brought here to forge a new identity. And then what is that identity that they have to adapt? It is their oppressor's identity. And so when I think about masculinity, I think about, well, whose masculinity is this? Is it really ours? And when we adapt this and adopt this masculinity, who does it harm?
What's remarkable about our culture of masculinity is that for most men, it's invisible. It's delivered to us beginning in infancy by our mothers, our fathers, brothers and sisters, the kids in the community, coaches, teachers, the media, right through adulthood, to the degree that when you ask a man or challenge a man's view of the culture of masculinity, he'll hear that often as a challenge of his own identity. And because MANBOX culture is about the continuous, ongoing, traumatic bullying and policing of men until we all sort of ascribe to this narrow definition of masculinity, he already has a lifetime of struggling to try to do it right based on the policing that goes on around him. So, but when we ask a man to consider, how are you performing masculinity? They don't say, well, let's have a conversation about the culture that all originated in. It's invisible to us. It's the air we breathe, the water we swim in. And accordingly, men are instantly defensive about the word masculinity, about phrases like toxic masculinity. And I sometimes wish we could just open it up by simply saying, we need to just pluralize the word masculinity, masculinities, millions of performances of masculinity, each distinctive to the individual who's performing them. If we can open that idea up that there's a multitude of ways to do it, all equally valued, then we break this idea that masculinity is about conformity, because it's in that conformity that a lot of the anxiety and rage and frustration and violence comes up for men, because we're alienated from ourselves. And in the process of becoming alienated from ourselves, that rage is then weaponized and directed at others, at other races, at other religions, at other immigration statuses, at other genders.
Daniel, what you said of whose masculinity is this, to what some of you are saying, There are women who have had to adopt masculine traits to move up in their career, to move up within an organization, right? And so what is rewarded, what is acknowledged, what is celebrated, those qualities that are by definition a celebration of a select few and at the detriment of literally the majority. So I want to move into what is the work? What are you trying to create?
For me, and in the circles of spheres that I am in, the work is really about the transformation of the hearts and minds of men. Right? All of the things that Mark and Stefan and Danielle and I talked about previously is about being able to actually do a lot of emotional laboring work where men can actually connect and be interconnected, not only to themselves, but in the relationships that they're in, care for those relationships, like emotionally and spiritually care for those relationships, not just move through their heads in the world and not just move through, I think what Jackson Katz calls just their outer layer only, just the mask that they have on only, but really like move through their body as well too. So it's the connection of the mind and body and all of that. And that's so very important. And it's very labor intensive and energy work. So it's really healing work. It is really intimate work. It is really work that a lot of men yearn for and want. And I remember years ago, there was a group that was starting in North Minneapolis, and the question was asked, what got you here? Or what was the excuse that got you here to this group today? A lot of the men, none of them admitted that they were going to come to such a group. They had to make up something else, right? Because that wasn't what, and that's still the case, right? That's still the case is when we create these spaces, men don't come and masculine identities don't come. But if we create it around something else, in like a football game, or what are the ways in which men and masculine folks associate already, and then how do you bring these conversations into play, right? And so I think that those are the kinds of things that we do and we talk about, and it's really deeply enriching work because it is really about the transformation of their hearts and minds, right? If we are going to end gender-based violence, whether it be domestic violence or sexual violence or any other forms of violence based on one's gender that doesn't conform to masculinity the way that we were talking about it, then that means that it really is going to take us practicing masculinity and manhood with one another. It takes us being accountable in those spaces with us. What keeps me accountable and what keeps me practicing is the spaces and the relationships that I have with the men and masculine folks that I have had over the years in very intimate ways, right?
I think about, especially when you think about the ways that Black Lives Matter has led everyone to kind of reimagine a new environment, a new world. I think we have to do the exact same approach, is reimagine a new masculine, reimagine new identities that is whole, right? That is whole, that is so that we can minimize harm, not only to our partners, not only to our children, not only to our community members, but also to the environment, right? And so it's healing our relationships with everything. And so I just think that's where a lot of the work needs to go. It's like, and lastly, your relationship with yourself, because oftentimes we come into these conversations or we come into it broken, right? And in need of repair, need of healing. And so I just think it's important that we dive in these conversations, build community of men who are willing to be with each other, to be step in step. Because I mean, when you think about masculine culture, period, is based around shame, right? Shaming others for not conforming. And so what does it look like for us to say, it's okay? What does it look like for us to say, I love you, despite some of the problematic behaviors that you exhibit? What does it look like to say, you know what? I love this portion of you needs work, but the rest of you is beautiful. What does that look like, right? And so I think that requires, right, intentionality. That requires a reimagining of love. It requires a reimagining of relationships. It requires a reimagining of the entire work.
how can we prevent violence, especially for me, like gender-based violence, because I think that's, at the heart of gender inequality, but all forms of violence, really. And I think that actually so much of that, in order to do that, we have to not change what it means to be a man so much, but kind of as like what Mark was saying, just completely open it up so that men can actually have the freedom to be whoever they want to be their true selves. And I think that by doing that, violence isn't inevitable, even though we often might see it that way. It's not inevitable. If we change society, we can prevent it from happening in the first place. But I think that it's not just about individuals, even though obviously each of us as individuals has a part to play. It is about also those wider social structures. And so I suppose in order to change those, for me, I do think ultimately there's part of it as well is about kind of building a movement, right? And including among men, I suppose, men being allies to other movements for social justice in that respect, and therefore pushing for the wider kind of social change that's needed to create a society which is more equal and just. And I think we have a really vital part to play there, but perhaps a lot of us aren't doing that, as much as we could be currently. And obviously men do hold more positions of power in society. So we could be playing a much bigger role than I think we are currently.
I think it's also important to understand how a dominance-based masculinity actually operates in the lives of young boys. Niobe Way wrote a book called Deep Secrets, and what her research was about, she asked boys in early adolescence, what does your best friend mean to you? And those boys in early adolescence would say, I love my best friend. They'd use the word love unashamedly. And the other thing they would always say is, without my best friend, I would go crazy, because they shared these deep, intimate, connecting conversations with those other boys. By late adolescence, these same boys are saying, well, my best friend Mikey lives around the corner, but I don't see him so much anymore. He's a good basketball player, no homo, they'll throw that in. And another boy would say, yeah, that close friendship, it's kind of on a crossfade, it's kind of fading out. And what she discovered was these boys are no longer concerned with what's authentic to them. What they are instead doing in late adolescence is proving what they are not. And the exact language that they're proving they are not is little kids, girly, or gay. So our dominance-based culture of masculinity trains boys out of connection. And that disconnection actually begins much, much earlier. Judy Chu wrote a book called When Boys Become Boys, and talks about how boys as early as 3 and 4 years old are already hiding their emotional acuity, their ability to see and respond to emotional cues, how they're taking on the sort of stoic model of masculinity that the culture puts on them. But the long and short of it is that boys who are too emotional, too connecting, they get bullied back into the box. We break connection for boys. We disengage them from close friendships. And then all they're left with is a hierarchical dominance-based model of masculinity. In order to confirm their masculinity, they simply dominate those around them. And the thing that's really important to notice embedded in this process, which goes on hourly for boys, this constant bullying back into the box, is that it's done through the denigration of the feminine. We take a bunch of aspects of naturally human capacities like empathy and connection and caregiving. We define them as feminine, which is not correct. They're simply human capacities. And then we shame them out of boys by saying, what are you, a girl? What are you, a sissy? So in the daily, hourly microaggressions that break boys' connection, we are also brainwashing them to believe that girls and women are less. And once you teach a population that the other gender is less, it doesn't take much more to teach them that another race is less or another religion is less. So all of our cultures of white and male supremacy are embedded in that process by which we break boys' connection.
I'm so glad you mentioned this, Mark, because as a woman, when I hear about gender-based violence, for me, yes, those extreme forms of physical assault, sexual assault, physical assault, emotional assault are absolutely violent. However, those moments of entitlement of a man over a woman is as much a violent behavior and an act of violence as is something that big and tragic and horrific. There is a presupposition that one is less than the other. And what is it going to take to break that? And I am not just talking about women. I am talking about white over everyone else, cisgender over everyone else, right? It's all it's stemming from this space of what is taught, what is internalized. I want to, can we dig into the space of these micro behaviors of violence? The term sissy, the term, all of these terms, homo, etc. Those are violent terms. Those are acts of violence towards those communities when we even put them. Oh, you're fighting like a girl, or you're playing like a girl. When is it time to name that, and what do we do to move past it in terms of accountability for men?
You're absolutely so right, Farah, and I think that really gets to the heart of it, doesn't it? And I think often, like certainly here in the UK, you know, in the last year or two, we've had a lot of conversations about violence against women, because there've been some really horrific, high-profile murders of women in public spaces, and actually it's led to more of a focus on men. Actually, you know, people have started finally talking about, well, it is who's actually doing this violence in the first place. Oh, actually, it is predominantly men, and why is that? Where is that coming from? And how can men therefore actually play a positive role in all of this? And I suppose some men might get defensive and say, well, I've never perpetrated violence or abuse or harassment. What's this got to do with me? And I think what you're saying kind of gets to the heart of it, doesn't it? That probably all of us at some point or another have heard these kinds of everyday sexist, misogynistic, homophobic comments, and stayed silent about it, because it is difficult to challenge it, right? It's a lot easier to go along with that when it's happening in your day-to-day life. But I think for me that's really the key thing, you know, that we can start doing is whenever we hear that kind of stuff, we actually do speak out about it. And I don't think that has to involve being confrontational or anything like that, but it, you know, it involves creating dialogues with people and saying, like, hey, what do you mean by that? Or why are you saying that? Like, where is that coming from, kind of thing? And I think all of us can make a difference in that regard. And that's a kind of positive thing that I think that men can do. But it can be uncomfortable, because it does mean reflecting on how all of us at one point or another might have been kind of complicit in perpetuating these things, even if we didn't express it ourselves, you know, just by staying silent about it. I think we are complicit, and that goes for other forms of oppression as well, I think. So I suppose for me, a key step in kind of towards allyship would be challenging those kinds of things. Also, those kinds of everyday, like, reinforcements of narrow ideas about masculinity and femininity as well is a big part of that, I think.
One of the things that I do want to lift up is that, to Stefan's point earlier, is that the violence will always continue. The strategy is to engage men and masculine folks in it to speak up, right? That's the strategy, and that's the strategy that we're talking about here. Just because we engage all men and masculine folks doesn't mean patriarchy is going to all of a sudden collapse. Doesn't mean that violence is all of a sudden going to end, because it's going to take all of us. I think that there are some comments that kind of come through the chat as well, that even though men benefit greatly from patriarchy and these acts of violence, women actually enforce it. The same way as white women enforce white supremacy, and white men get to gain from it, right? And so I think we actually have to really understand the privileges that, Farah, you were talking about, that are at play, and who gets it, and who gets to attain it, and then who gets to earn it, and then who loses it at times. And I think that that's really important. What I'm getting to in the act of, like, how do we actually take away some of these things that are already in the environment, is that it takes a culture of practice. I think that it really takes a culture of practice of men and masculine folks practicing with one another, learning how to be in conversation with one another, learning how to be with one another in those conversations. And it takes some, like, care and concern. It doesn't mean that we have to get it all right. It doesn't mean that we have to be politically correct. I've seen some really beautiful stuff to some of the stories that maybe you all have seen as well too, when men and masculine identities and folks care for other people, and they're just like, hey buddy, what's really going on? I see you going down the rabbit hole. Can we have a conversation here? Or we're a group of friends, and somebody's like, say, we're gonna go to the strip club, and we're like, no, probably we're not gonna go, just because we're gonna go somewhere else because it promotes sex trafficking and sexual exploitation, right? So I think it could be in its most basic form, and it could be in its most heightened state of, like, awareness generating and doing a lot of political education and things like that. So I think it comes in a mass array of things. I think the thing and the challenge to me is, how do we move beyond those micro behaviors? Is how do we move to make sure that men and masculine folks really understand the power and the privilege and the responsibility that they have, which is big responsibility. You have big power, you have big privilege, so you have a big responsibility in that, right? And to not silence that, or to not take that away, or to not minimize that, and that it is their responsibility. It is my responsibility as a male identified person to act and to act in a different way. And I think that has always been a challenge and opportunity and a joy in doing this work with men and masculine folks, at least for myself.
I also want to point out that a lot of these individual practices are informed by a systematic practice, the systems that are constantly invading our lives, right? The system itself is the container that holds all these things in place. And so if we don't address the systematic issue, the systems, the outcomes we're not going to see huge outcomes. We're going to continue to see it on an individual basis. Okay, one person changed out of 20 or 50 or 60, but you have to change the system itself that reproduces itself through generations, from one generation to the next. And so, yeah, so I just think that we have to begin to address those things, right? To challenge them, to question, why do these things exist? Why do these practices and policies exist? What kind of harm does it create? And what kind of culture does it persist from one generation to the next?
Can you name what are those systemic structures and practices that need to be named and disrupted? What is it that you are specifically referring to?
Yeah, I know from my context, it's the mass incarceration system. And that system itself shapes boys and it shapes men. It shapes the way they behave. It shapes the way that they behave within their communities, right? And so oftentimes, like, there's this. And it also, when you look at it from a systems perspective, you begin to break up some of the bad narratives that continue to kind of populate when they say, specifically when they say Black fathers don't want to be there for their kids. It's like, well, have you actually looked at the historical narrative? Like, have you looked at the history behind why that might be the case? What you're looking at is an outcome. What you're not looking at is the motivating factor that creates these outcomes. And when you look at it, you go, oh, mass incarceration has ripped these Black men from their homes. And so therefore, you cannot build a connection with your children. And so when they come back into the community, when they come back from these systems, they are really harmed. And what they do is they just replicate that harm to their children. Right. And so I think it's important when we look at these systems is to see, well, who does it benefit? And then begin to challenge those things so that we can change the way that they impact and affect our families, the way that they impact our communities, so these things don't continue to be replicated.
I'd like to also be very clear about the impact that dominance-based masculinity has on men as a mass population. And one of the very powerful impacts it has is that it's designed to make men silent. You can be as loud as you want as long as you're enforcing these traditional ideas about dominance masculinity. But if you speak outside of that, one of the things that you get bullied back into the box for is going off script. So what we have is we have millions of men in America. I would specifically call out white men who actually don't support some of the really challenging and damaging aspects of our culture and society, but they have been trained into silence over the course of their lives by alpha male bullies in their cohorts that immediately put heat on them if they ever speak up about anything. Hey, we're not going to a strip club. Oh, what's the matter with you? You know, what, are you suddenly effeminate? You know, that whole blowback from men who have self-appointed themselves the police of all masculinity. And the degree to which we passively accept that and say, well, you know, I'm going to take care of my own family and get my daughters to a good college, but I'm not going to get involved in this larger public discourse because it could cost me some comfort level at my workplace because there's a couple of guys there that might get in my face. And the degree to which we have the privilege to simply step out of this and get on the sidelines and not be in the game is appalling. When we see the damage and destruction that's going all around us. So it is time for men to understand. We should get a little angry and a little heat about the fact that we've been bullied into silence in a world where men are constantly complaining about feminists criticizing us and all these other folks, but we completely deny the impact in our lives of the boys and men around us who bullied us into silence all our lives. And this is the great hypocrisy of male resentment and fragility at being criticized. We've already been bullied into silence by our own gender and by our own cohorts. So it's time for men to get off the sidelines and get in the game about being public about what's right and what's fair and what's decent.
All right, so let's dive into accountability, friends. Y'all have named it a couple of times, and I like what Mark said at the end, right? Let's start speaking up. So I'm going to start with some of our guest questions. How are you working with fellow male identified folk in your life to push against toxic masculinity? And then there are some sub questions, you know, in case you want to add color to them. What is men's responsibility to women, to the LGBTQ+ communities, to our racially marginalized communities, Black, Brown, Asian, etc.?
In Man Forward, it's really the spaces that we create with one another and the spaces that we create for Southeast Asian men to come and learn and be in community and be in that connection. And that space is set up for that accountability to happen. And partially part of the reason why I say that is because of the connections that are made through that space and outside of that space as well too, and the relationships that are built, right? The ways in which we share our stories about our lives, how we're doing is not just how I am doing, but how am I doing in my relationships as well. The unlayering of that and then layering of our own intimate places of vulnerability and emotions to one another in that space allows us to actually build accountable practices, because it's not just about thinking about somebody else holding me accountable, but it's about me being intentional about the way in which I move and the choices that I make on an everyday basis. I always say to our folks, we have to wake up every day and betray patriarchy. At midnight, it ends. It's gone. The pumpkin comes again. The carriage is gone. Tomorrow morning, you're going to have to make the carriage again. Right. So what are you going to do tomorrow morning to actually betray patriarchy again? And that takes intentional acts. There's no credit building, right? And I say that because there's so much of the conversation of good men versus bad men, and then the stories that we see on the news of like fraternity boys or college men committing rape or sexual assault and then getting credit for it because we're going to ruin his reputation or his future because he's been a good guy ever since. There's no good guy credit, because I can never be a good guy as a man of color. That just is not possible at this moment in the context of racism, is that I won't ever be seen as a good guy. And so I think that is really important for us to think about. And the other part of it is in ensuring that the voices and experiences of the women folks and the LGBTQ and gender non-conforming folks in my community are really lifted up, is that we are talking to one another as if those folks are in the room with us. We have to pay attention to those folks being in the space with us, whether they're there physically, spiritually, or in other ways. We have to pay attention to them. And if they are no longer in the room and we are then centering our lives again, men and masculine folks' lives again and our experiences again, that means that we're no longer accountable, right? And so there has to be some depth and richness to it. And then there has to be also some lift to it as well too. And then for us, the other place that I want to mention is that when somebody does in fact commit harm, right? And it is found out that somebody actually commits harm, then we go into accountability circles. We call it compassionate accountability, right? That we believe that there's a way for people to actually transform from places of harm, to learn from those places as well and to not do it again. And so we go into circle with one another, three people along with the individual who committed harm, you know, and it's a process. It's a 6 month to a year process, or even longer than that, right? However long it takes for that person to get to a place where they fully understood why they got to the place where they committed that choice of harm and how they're going to catch themselves the next time around to not do that, or how they're going to probably seek for help. And so I think that that's why I said what I said earlier, is that it takes a lot of energy work and a lot of emotional laboring work on men's end to be able to do that accountability piece with one another. And so important that we hear the voices and experiences of the people in our community who are most impacted in our community. And that is vitally true. And I always say that is because we know what's best, the best solutions for our communities. You know, Hmong women have been doing this work for 40 plus years, you know, and so it's really important that white women who are feminists understand that Hmong women have that experience already and have that leadership. They don't need to be cultivated to be feminists. they are feminists in themselves. And I think that we also have to fight that constantly in communities of color and as Black and Brown folks, is that our leadership, even for my leadership as doing this work, is not often seen as well too, and is not seen as valuable as those of white men who've been doing this work. Right?
Yeah, I think for myself, when I think about the accountability part, right, is to be among men. I think that's an important part, right? To be in the community of men. I think oftentimes, as you know, Mark Greene said, like we get bullied into believing that we're supposed to be isolated, we're supposed to be alone warriors, not realizing that we actually need community. We actually need community from other men. And it actually took me a long time to actually admit that to myself. I said that I actually need other men to feel good about myself. Not only do I need my partner, but I need other men, right? And to have good conversation and for them to hold me accountable as I hold them accountable. And so I think a lot of times is be in the conversation, be in the lives of other men. And it's not there, like when I go in these communities of men, I'm not there to fix them, right? I'm there to create a relationship, a deep relationships, in hopes that when we get in conversation, that we can deepen each other in our wisdom and the information that we're getting, and to challenge what we're thinking, right? The ideologies that we adopt, the practices that we perform, so that we can be the best versions of ourselves. And so I know for myself, you know, as a community organizer, I was always in the community working with young boys and young men. But now as someone who, you know, works with other organizations, kind of doing my own consulting firm, is now I'm working in other spaces like corporations, organizations, and working with the men there and say, okay, what's going on here? Let's look at the way that you manage other folks. Are you listening to the women who are among you? And I think that's also another key point here, is to listen to women, right? Is to get some of that really key feedback and input from women. Women have been writing about the ways that men have been harming them for a long time. And so to get that kind of input is necessary and important for you to be reflective on the culture of masculinity. And another part is that, you know, I think oftentimes men are afraid to admit that they adopt these ideologies and they're afraid to admit that they're wrong. They're afraid to admit that the identity that they've built themselves around could be false, could be a stack of lies. And so how do we, instead of holding for it and protecting that, what does it look like for them to actually be reflective, to look at, okay, does this actually get to the end goal that you want? And if it doesn't, what are all the alternatives? And I think that's the missing piece, is what are the other alternatives? What can you do besides behaving this way? What are some other ways that are a little bit more restorative, a little bit more less harming and more loving towards yourself, but also towards others?
There's reams of medical data around what happens to men who are isolated. And the thing about MANBOX culture, when it silences us, the way that it does it is it polices out of a public acknowledgement of those aspects of ourselves which are distinctive and authentic. And that can be something as large as our sexual identity. A man may hide the fact that he's gay, to something much smaller in terms of like that perhaps we don't admit to our friends that we have gentle, caring things that we do for our wife because we'll be accused of not being masculine enough. So every man out there has aspects of himself, authentic aspects of himself. The beginning in childhood were bullied and policed out of him. And how can we possibly have an authentic relationship if big sections of who we are were long ago hidden away? So instead, we do this surface performance of masculinity. We keep doing these markers of the man box. Yeah, I made some money. Yeah, I had sex. Yeah, I got this car. And we play that game over and over again, sometimes for decades, trying to connect with other men because we want connection, but we're trying to do it from within the constraints of hiding authentic aspects of ourselves. The end result is that we have epidemic levels of isolation in the US. 1 out of every 2 people in a study by Cigna in 2018 indicated that 1 out of 2 every people in America feel sometimes they're always alone. And when you have what is called chronic isolation, when you're at that level of isolation, and millions of American men are, it's the equivalent of smoking a pack of cigarettes a day in terms of the health impact. You get dramatically higher levels of heart disease, cancer, diabetes, neurodegenerative diseases, all sorts of ailments. Men literally die earlier because we're so busy performing this isolated, narrow performance of masculinity that we never form intimate connection. And this is why it's hard to get men to come in and join a circle, because we're absolutely afraid that we won't even know who we are when we sit down in that circle. We've been so trained out of connection with ourselves. And when you have that level of isolation, you have immense amount of anxiety, because you're in man box culture. You're constantly being policed by the men around you. You don't want to make any mistakes, but also you're obligated to watch the other men and police them. And that level of anxiety constantly exists for men and constantly grows for us. And when it gets high enough, in man box culture, we're encouraged to vent it out sideways as violence against someone supposedly further down the hierarchy. So against women or BIPOC people or whoever, right? And the long and short of all of this is that men are desperately and horrifyingly alone. We live lives of immense isolation. And so what I offer men right now to any man listening to this conversation is, whenever you're ready to come in from the cold and connect, there are men right here. Pheng, Daniel, they're doing this work with men. We're all doing this work, and we will welcome you into a circle, and you can bring that part of yourself that you've hidden away sometimes for decades and start to connect in authentic ways, and you will live longer, and you will finally be at peace with yourself.
I am a parent of two, so two sons. I have a 2-year-old and a 5-month-old. And so when my 2-year-old came, when my wife and I found out that, we were pregnant, and well, she was pregnant, but you get the gist. And so we wanted to do like kind of a baby blessing. And so we did a baby blessing for her and did a baby blessing for me. And so I invited all my male friends, even my cousins, everyone that I can think of. And then what I didn't tell them was that we were going to have a circle, right? And so we're going to have and so we brought them in. It was probably like 50 to 60 people in the backyard. We're doing barbecue. We're doing everything that you can think of. And then at some point I said, hey, I just want to bring everyone in a circle to have a conversation. And so we sat down, and I don't think anyone knew what was going on. And so I had a number of cue cards that had certain things for them to reflect on, like your own childhood, your parenthood, the way that you've seen men in your life. What are some things that you gained out of some of these relationships, but also what are some destructive behaviors that you would change if you had the opportunity. And so we were having this deep conversation, and some of the men got up and left. Right. And so they left. And as they walked past me, they said, I'm not comfortable with this. And so I just think it's important to understand that this is a practice that you have to be committed to. I know that some of the people are going to walk away. Maybe they've never been part of these kind of conversations before. I know I do it for work, but to put it in my life, to do it with the men who are personally connected to me, like it changes dynamic, but also it's establishing a new norm. It's establishing a new way of relating to each other. And so, yes, they didn't participate this time, but guess what? Next time we're going to see each other, we're going to do it again. We're going to do it again and do it again in different ways, in hopes that it changes their heart, right? It transforms their heart so that one day they'll be able to contribute to the conversation. And I think that's what it takes. It takes us to be committed to this journey, to create the opportunities for men to connect.
Yeah, and I mean, I can't really follow that up, but I just wanted to say, like, for me, I think, there are so many ways that men can do this work. And these are perfect examples of actually, like, in our personal lives, in our family lives, in our friend lives, these are like some of the most important places to be doing the work. But also, yeah, in the other spaces where we live our lives. And I don't mean we're asking every man out there to go and set up like a new violence prevention organization or something. If anything, like, we should be going into the places where we already live our lives. So for example, for me, I work at a university, and that gives me lots of opportunities. I'm very lucky to talk about these issues with men, in my research, and then I can hopefully raise these kinds of issues with policymakers, like Daniel was saying, push for that wider structural change. Also in my teaching, I've got academia gives you a lot of platforms to raise these issues. And just something else I just wanted to highlight there as well is that I do think there is a particular responsibility on those of us who have like multiple layers of privilege, right? So for me, as a man who is white, who's cisgender, heterosexual, able-bodied, middle class, that gives me multiple layers of privilege that I need to kind of address. And also it gives me opportunities which perhaps other men don't necessarily have, because I think sometimes there are greater costs, for men when speaking out about these issues, if they are a man of color or if they are from a poor or working class background, they might face higher levels of policing because of these multiple intersecting, forms of oppression. So I think there is added responsibility on me because of that. And also I think in terms of accountability, we know that sometimes men can be kind of put on a pedestal as well for doing this work, right? That we get more attention, more praise than women might do for saying the same things women are saying. And again, especially if we're white and middle or upper class and so on and so forth. So that's why accountability is so important, that we're not reproducing the inequalities which we're actually seeking to challenge. So exactly as Daniel said, I suppose, listening to women, listening to all the groups that we're seeking to be allies to, and really taking on board what they're saying in everything we're doing, really.
Gosh, that was so much incredible stuff. I heard distinctly there's that personal space of accountability. And I'm also hearing, which we haven't really named, and I want to create space for this, of what is that collective accountability. So when we do work with clients at FARSIGHT with organizations, we always say we are going to center the needs of the communities within your organization that have been historically oppressed, that have been historically excluded. I want to talk about that space of responsibility, and I want to now navigate this into the workplace and tying it into a question that we got that really kind of brings it together. Does this work result in a bifurcated masculinity where one is for work and one is for my family and community? Right? To the point that Daniel and Mark spoke about, that you might have your circles where you are doing this work, where you are building connection, but those deep spaces of fear or habit or conditioning or socialization makes you default to old ways of dominance and patriarchy and entitlement in the workplace. Someone's fear, not doing something based on someone's discomfort or fear, is perpetuating violence and harm. And how does one reconcile that?
I'd like to share some data from Catalyst, which speaks directly to this question. And what this data shows us is that the same influence that MANBOX culture is having in families and in communities is also very strongly enforced in the workplace. To begin with, Catalyst tells us that 62% of US workers are considered lonely. And that means 97 million workers are in the workplace feeling completely isolated. But what they discovered about traditional masculine norms being enforced in the workplace is that it creates immense masculine anxiety for men at work. And men at work often experience this masculine anxiety, which is distress over not living up to society's rigid masculine standards. Now, here's the tricky part. It's not simply affecting men. In fact, it's driving men to remain silent when violence or abuse or microaggressions or whatever are happening to women. Masculine anxiety, which is exacerbated by a combative culture, they call this a combative culture at work, is widespread. Nearly 99% of all men indicated that their workplace has some level of combative culture. And when there is combative culture, men say they are far less likely to speak up when sexist or racist behavior takes place. So it's so threaded into this process of bullying and policing, even in the workplace, that again, that epidemic level of silence is going on there.
The wholeness that I think we were all talking about in some pieces in some respects earlier in the conversation, and like the coming together within oneself as a masculine person or as a man person, as a whole person, is needed, right? And I think to Stefan's point earlier is that not all of us has to be doing this work, get paid to do this work. In fact, all of us should actually be doing it. It means that we cannot only live it out in certain spaces only. And we say that in Man Forward spaces, is that if you're only doing it in the space when you come and you're only practicing it with us, then you've gotten it all wrong, right? And in fact, it's actually more important that you practice it out there and you come and check it out with us in here in the space to see if it's right, and then you keep practicing it out there, right? So that bifurcation that you're talking about, Farah, is that I think that shows us still the piece of men navigating their power and privilege, and then in some ways still being attached to that power and privilege and not knowing how to navigate that. I think what I've come to learn over the years for myself around understanding power and privilege is on the onset, the guilty pieces that Mark was talking about earlier on, about like, oh, don't talk about men, or when you're talking about men, I feel defensive. That piece is that you feel guilty, right? You feel guilty, you feel ashamed of male privilege. And then you get to a place where you understand it. And then you will get to a place where you know how to actually navigate it. And then you get to a place where you actually now can say, I'm going to actually take responsibility for it, because I'm going to actually use it for something better, rather than actually something that I'm supposed to be I'm told to be enacting in these ways, right? And so we have to learn how to have a relationship with power and privilege, and be responsible for those things. And I think that is the part about the streamlining, or the coming together as a whole person and as a whole man, quote unquote, too, and to not be saying, I'm going to do it only in certain parts of my life, but in certain parts I'm not going to. And that's okay when we're seeing men do that and struggle through that, because I think that witnessing men struggle through those things is really important. And for us to witness each other's growth in that, to Daniel's point earlier on, is really important as well, too. And I think that's why men coming and being in community together to do these things with one another, to do these acts and actions and behaviors and thoughts in the emotional laboring that I was talking about, is really important. Because if we don't do that, then obviously, as we've talked about, who bears the brunt of that, right? It's going to be the women folks and the gender non-binary folks and gender queer folks in community who are going to bear the brunt of that impact.
One of the things in community organizing spaces, what we always tell our allies is that you have to put your lives on the line. That's how the work gets done, right? Black and brown folks have been putting their lives on the line for a long time, from generation to generation, to move society along, to grow society. And so now we need you to reciprocate that. Put your life on the line. And that means running the risk of being fired, running the risk of not being in that organization. That means you're willing to push leadership. It means that you're not being bought by power, but you're working through power. This idea of working through power to change systems, I think, is really important. And so one of the things, even for myself, right, looking at all the different identities we all occupy, I know that there are certain male privileges that I have, even though racially I don't have some of those privileges, but as a male in my gender, yes, I hold privilege. And so I remember in my other organization, one of the nonprofit organizations that I helped start, there was 4 of us who started the organization, 3 men, 1 woman. And in the conversation around like how the growth and the development of the organization, it became the story of the 3 men. The story of the 3 men. And at one point in time, I didn't think about it. I was just kind of just doing a thing. And one time I really thought about the story and I said, hold up, there was a woman there the entire time. How she's becoming invisible in the story. And so I had to, in the middle of a retreat, stopped the retreat. And I said, hold up. If we are trying to be equitable and we are fighting for a just cause, then we ourselves are practicing we're at alignment with our own mission, because we have not, we are replicating the dominant narrative that men started this organization when there was a woman there the entire time. And so we have to rectify our own story. We have to begin to look at the ways that we are practicing patriarchy in our own organization. And so it took me in a leadership position to do that very thing, was to challenge. And again, it's to risk my power to be ousted. Did the ED like that I called them out in the middle of that? Absolutely not. Right. And so I think it's important to understand is if you're in a position of power, is to work through it, to say, I'm going to use this power so I can create space and opportunities for those who are never at the table.
I suppose, I think men are really encouraged by society to define ourselves predominantly in relation to our work, to the workplace, right? That's what's it's still seen as to some extent a manly space in lots of environments, and I think that creates lots of unhealthy dynamics, really, especially when our economy is so unequal, and work isn't actually paying people very well in many cases, or if not, maybe not at all in many cases as well. Also, for some men, it means that their kind of work just creates so much stress and anxiety for them. It's unbearable. But so I do think there's something there as well about, like, men need to, I think we all, and I could include myself in this, need to find more meaning outside of work, in the other spaces of our lives, in our families, creating more kind of caring relationships with all the people in our lives outside of the workplace as well as in the workplace. So maybe there's even a lesson there for men involved in this field, because I think, doing this kind of work can take over your entire life. And on the one hand, that's how it should be, I guess. But on the other hand, like, also we do kind of need to practice what we preach, right? In terms of having healthy relationships, and making sure, that we've got that kind of balance in our lives, as well, I suppose. And just lastly, I do think there is a particular responsibility as well on men who are in positions of power and influence in the workplace, right? Because they've got a great deal of power to push things in different ways, to build gender equality in the workplace, and other forms of equality, because I think that plays a huge role in creating healthier cultures as well. Changing the structures has a knock-on effect on the culture, and that's really crucial in terms of preventing violence and abuse, which of course happens a lot in the workplace as well.
I want to move to the role of data in this work. I know Mark brought up this report from Catalyst. Stephen, you're a researcher. Daniel, I believe you're doing some work in the data world. In this work, again, of all kinds of anti-oppression, that includes this conversation as well, along with all of the other marginalized identities, especially in these last few decades, more and more measuring impact, measuring consequence has become another tool to do that drum beating, to do that, to be that voice saying, here is what's happening, or here is what has shifted. So I'd love to hear from those of you who are plugged into data, who value it in your work, use it in your work. What shifts have you been seeing? It's been 5 years since the Me Too movement, I believe, right? But the Me Too movement was just a moment in a lifetime of this violence existing.
In terms of talking about change, about the impact of COVID-19, right, which has obviously had huge impacts on our lives in so many ways. And I think there's lots of issues there going on with gender and other inequalities, which are really important to think about. For example, like globally, more men are dying of COVID-19, which is obviously horrible. But I mean, so for every 10 women dying from COVID globally, there are 13 men dying. And partly that's actually kind of a slightly inaccurate, or it's not a whole statistic, because a lot of countries don't even actually collect data where they break it down based on different, genders in that way. But partly, obviously, there's varied reasons for that. But a part of that is about expectations around masculinity. I think that men are not encouraged to look after ourselves or our wider community to the same extent. So you do see a lot of men, not wearing masks, not washing our hands, not, being careful about social distancing and things like that. So we have seen these issues really playing out in the pandemic, I think, and the impact on men's own health is just one example of that. I mean, we've also seen horrific impacts in terms of exacerbation of violence and abuse, like domestic abuse during lockdowns, often got worse because for lots of victims, they were kind of trapped at home with their abusers in many cases. Governments weren't necessarily even taking this into account. And we know that like 1 in 3 women globally will experience like intimate partner violence or sexual violence at some time in her life. I mean, just recently in the UK, there was a survey which was done, and that found that for young women aged between 18 and 24, 86% of them will experience sexual harassment, or they have experienced sexual harassment in public at some point. And I don't think that kind of went down during the pandemic, even though the streets were quieter. And obviously now we see this happening more and more online as well. So I think there have been steps forward. Like I think the Me Too movement has, really encouraged reflection about these issues. But I think we've got a hugely long way to go, as well as those statistics kind of indicate. And there was also one I saw earlier today as well, just because I knew knew you were going to ask about data, and I was reading a paper which just reminded me of some of the things which Daniel was mentioning around. So for men who are in prison, studies suggest that between 62% and 87% of them have experienced some kind of trauma in their lives prior to going to prison. So I think that just shows, right, the depth of the problem, that for so many men who are themselves potentially doing harm, they themselves have experienced harm and trauma in their own lives. And then in prison, that's also a very traumatizing environment, right? So that just shows to me that these problems are so deep rooted, but at the moment, we're really not, doing the right things if we want to actually try and solve them and prevent them and actually help men to change their behavior, I suppose.
Data is important because it talks about the collective story. Right. I think oftentimes, men think that these are isolated incidents, right? So they go, okay, this is just me, the way that I'm performing poorly. And so when you start to have the conversation and show them, no, this is how many men are feeling, it opens up a conversation. They go, oh, I didn't realize that other men are struggling with the same thing. Right. And so I just think that you can utilize data in a number of ways, but certainly one of those to open up conversations around the ways that men are dealing with this pressure of masculinity, with this pressure of having to perform every single moment of your life. And so certainly if there is data, leverage it to have conversations with folks, because it opens up the possibility that it's more than just them.
I have a piece of data, and it's heartbreaking. I talked about the degree to which boys are trained out of their intimate, close friendships by late adolescence. Niobe Way also reveals in her book that by late adolescence, their suicide numbers become 4 times that of girls their age. So when we talk about men experiencing trauma, one of the things that I think is just the water we swim in is the degree of abuse that it takes to train us out of being in friendship. And I often invite people to think about watching, if you've ever watched 3 and 4-year-old boys play together, they are absolutely, and they play with girls, boys, non-binary kids, it doesn't matter. The way that they play, the immense joy they get out of those friendships, and they'll take a cardboard box and turn it into a train, and then a rocket ship, and then a car, and they're doing it improvisationally, and they're doing it completely without rancor, and they're sharing ideas and building on each other. This whole joyful experience of being a boy that men, all of us, remember from our own childhoods. How much trauma and violence and abuse by dominance culture does it take for us to give that up? Men live deeply isolated lives, and we have this grief about something that we remember from long ago, this sense of connection and joy in relationship to our friends. I'm here to tell you that when you go in and do men's work, it comes back again. I have felt that same joy when I look into the face of men that I know and love. And I have to tell you, to some degree, I feel it looking into your face, Daniel, and Pheng and Stephen, because I know you men are in this process of being in connection. You've said, I'm not buying that thing about an isolated, bootstrap, individualized masculinity. It's a death trap.
You just reminded me of the health survey that I did with the men's group that I work with. And this men's group that I work with is actually a fight club, one of the largest fight clubs in the nation. We did a health survey with 60 of them. We just wanted to focus on 60 at one particular branch, and said, okay, we gave them a number of questions around how they feel before they got into, how they're feeling before they got into the fight club, which is predominantly all men, and then how they feel after. And one of the key things that came out of this was that 42% of them were contemplating suicide before they joined this group, 42% of them. And then after they joined this group, 73% of those 42% said that they no longer contemplated suicide. And I think it's important because when we looked at, well, what are the top 5 reasons why they joined this group? And one would think, well, it's to be violent, it's to fight, it's to pursue a pro career. And that wasn't the case. The number one reason why they joined was, one, to be part of a community. That was the top reason, to be part of a community. This last statistic here is that 69% of them strongly agree, since joining the fight club, they have positive attitudes about themselves. It has improved. I think what these statistics and what this short study is demonstrating is that we need each other. We need other men to be in our lives. to feel good about ourselves and to hold ourselves accountable to the best that we can be, right? Not only to ourselves, but to others.
What is one thing, because we've talked, our conversations have alluded to boys, and I want to just be able to give that focus. What is one thing you would say to a caregiver, to a guardian, to a parent about messaging? What is one thing they can do differently immediately?
Farah, I have to jump on this. I've been thinking about you, Jeremy, who's been here watching the conversation from, I believe, Oakland, California. And he indicated he's got children to raise and he wants to do a better job. One of the things that we have to understand is that this larger culture of masculinity will isolate and break connection for our sons unless we are there for them. And what I'm about to talk about next, just very briefly, works for daughters, sons, non-binary kids. And that is that if we step in and create a container for them where we invite them to bring their whole selves, to ask us questions about what it means to be human, to share their own ideas, to co-create with them the parenting-child relationship, to let them fully express what's going on for them, ask questions, learn. When we create a container where they bring their fully authentic selves, we can immunize them against this gender binary stereotypical version of masculinity the culture tries to put on kids. And if we stay in relationship and conversation, I'm not talking about teaching and telling them all the time. I'm talking about asking them and learning from them and being in relationship with them. Brian Anderson, who's the founder of Fathering Together, said that he read a bunch of books before his daughter was born. And then when she was born, he understood that what he really needed to do was co-design parenting with her. And that's something that you don't read a book about. That's something you create with your child. If you will make a home and be in conversation with your children in an ongoing way where they feel seen and heard, they will eventually reach a tipping point of self-actualization and authentic expression where they'll reach a tipping point and that gender binary and that false man box version of masculinity will hold no appeal to them. They'll be like, no, why would I want that?
First of all, I'm not a parent or a caregiver, so I don't feel I'm actually, able to give advice to others in that respect. But I mean, the only thing I would say is I do think that actually listening to children and young people, right, about their own experiences, I mean, they have a unique and really valuable perspective on the world, which we don't have, because I've got no idea what life is like now for kids, So I think, listen to them, talk to them and ask them what's going on in their life. And hopefully in those conversations, you can bring up these kinds of issues and help them to think critically about the world and help them to deal with the issues they're experiencing. But yeah, first and foremost through listening. And just the other thing as well, because Mark's also said about like telling kids, and I think if we want kids to learn things from us, then actually I do think putting into practice equality and justice in our day-to-day lives, I think that has as big an impact as anything we actually say, I think, doesn't it? So that's all I would say. Thank you.
I think as a parent of two, one of the things that I've learned, I think it's probably been the most critical lesson for myself, is to parent myself. I think oftentimes we want to put all these restrictions on the way that they perform, the way that behave, the way that they express themselves. And I think it's important, right, to allow them to be free in a land that was never designed for them to be free, and a system that constantly reminds them they are not free. And so it's to create an environment where they can explore, where they can express however they like, and for you to understand that your limitations in this world, in the society, the way that you've been conditioned, that you want to limit them on the ways that they express themselves. And so for you to parent yourself and say, it is okay for them to explore. It is okay for them to, in the middle of a meeting, run out, right? Run and yell while you're having a conversation with a bunch of other folks, for them to yell, to get inside, to be right in front of the computer and say hi. It is okay. Because I think it's when you do that, you allow yourself to also grow. You allow yourself to also break those chains that have been placed on you by society. And it opens up new opportunities for you to be in conversation, to be in concert with your children, and open up new opportunities for you to bond with your child, to say, hey, there's nothing here that limits you. You're okay to be free. And I'm gonna continue to push the world to allow you to be free.
Just to be in care of other caregivers as well too. And it's important. we were having a conversation or an organic conversation the other day, and it just happened to turn into a fatherhood caregiver conversation. And many of the men were like, oh, I didn't know that this was possible, that I could do this with other men, right? That I could be talking about fatherhood and caregiving with other men. And so it's so important to be caregiving for ourselves in that moment as we are providers for other young ones as well too.
Stephen, Pheng, Mark, Daniel, thank you so much for your heart, your connection, and your generosity in this conversation. Stay well, and thank you for being here. Take care.
Bye, everybody.